What's the next stage?
Welcome back to the Miga Show with me, Miga. Today we're talking about Kamen Rider Kabuto. Kamen Rider Kabuto starts off in 1999 with a meteorite crashing into the city of Shibuya. On this meteorite, a species of aliens known as the worms exists. The worms have the ability to copy humans' appearances and memories, which they use to infiltrate the human race and wipe them out over time. Cut to 7 years later, and a guy named Arata Kagami works for an organization made to fight against the worms, known as ZECT. This organization has developed a new weapon to fight against the worms, known as the Kamen Rider system, which Kagami intends to use. But he is not the main character of the story. Our true main character is this guy, Tendo Soji, who steals the device that Kagami was going to use to transform to become Kamen Rider Kabuto. After this incident, we follow the many twists and turns of Tendo and Kagami's ever-growing bond and relationship with each other, including other riders such as Kagami eventually becomes his own rider and attack. But before that happens, we meet a few other riders. We have Kamen Rider the Bee or Yagaru Maso, also Kageyama Shun, but we'll get into their whole mess in their section. After that, we meet Kazama Daisuke or Kamen Rider Drake with his little buddy Gon. After that, we meet Tsurugi Kamishiro or Kamen Rider Sword and his butler Gia. Also, there's Kick and Punch Hopper, who again, I'll get to that. Also, there's Dark Kabuto, I'm not going to talk about beyond this. So yeah, Kabuto is another rider show with a very basic story, as many of the arcs are much more focused on the characters' interactions and the overall plots with fighting against the worms. When they do get deeper into what the worms are, it's not really good. They have us learn that before the worms that are Kamen Riders fight currently, there was a group of worms who created Kamen Riders known as the Native Worms. These Native Worms would also eventually decide to try and take over the world by turning all of humanity into Native Worms due to them fighting. Yeah, that's the part that it's pretty stupid. And I don't really care for it personally, but the characters are so good, I can overlook these issues. Let's get into those characters, by the way.
Kamen Rider Kabuto, この後すぐ
The man who walks the path of heaven himself. When we start out the show, Tendo seems like a weirdo chef, being good at things to an almost supernatural degree. It makes everyone mad jealous of him, alongside his weird grandiose statements, such as, "Do you face the sun and ask, why do you shine?" Or, "The girls just know of me, just as there's no one who does not know the light of the sun." Mannerisms like these and actions such as getting his power up by holding his hand out to the sky and willing it into existence because he knows he'll get in the future through the meeting his future self, and scenes that don't even make sense after this explanation, makes some people dislike his character. But I find these moments in Bro's general just personality the funniest thing in the world. We need more characters like this in general, to be honest. Also, Tendo's perfection is revealed later to be a flaw, as it stops him from understanding people emotionally. Like, yeah, he's good at pretty much everything and seems to understand people, but he's still very detached from others and arrogant in his actions, especially when he has to deal with his sister Hiyori's disappearance, and he starts to become a depressed and sad guy because of it. It's generally hard to watch this guy who seemingly was a pillar of competence be in so much pain. But at the same time, his mentality allows others to grow and be better. The path of heaven is the path focused on the continuous improvement of oneself to better the world around you. Tendo has reached the heaven of becoming the perfect man by continually improving himself until he reached that point, thus allowing him to influence others to follow their own path, and thus become perfect in their own ways. All of which creates one of the greatest protagonists of all time. But now, let's get into the guy that Tendo influences the most, and help Tendo in his time of need when he swayed from the path of heaven.
Kamen Rider Kabuto, この後すぐ
The guy that some say is the true protagonist of this show. They're wrong, but Kagami is a really good character in his own right. Starting out the series is the first victim of Tendo's greatness, seeing him as some weird arrogant guy. But eventually, the more he sees Tendo fight, the more he grows to respect him, even giving up his second chance to become a Kamen Rider if it meant that he had to defeat Tendo. But Tendo, at the same time, says that the two of them aren't even friends, which is a weird statement at first, especially because he immediately asks him to come over to his house for dinner. But there's a point in what Tendo says. Mainly, as Tendo follows the philosophy of essentially not being friends with someone he can't learn something from, with Kagami being one of those people currently, as he's dependent on Tendo's strength to fight the worms, not his own. But what is Kagami's path? Kagami's path is that of being straightforward. All Kagami wants to do is protect and help people out. The entire reason he even joins ZECT in the first place is that his own brother was taken by the worms. And when his brother, who was now a worm, came back, Kagami still wanted to show him mercy, despite knowing that it wasn't his brother and just some clone. While these traits get him berated by the others, especially Tendo, it's just the person Kagami is. And this dedication to being like this allows him to become his own rider and get attacked, where he continues to behave like this, such as in his first fight as Katak, where he goes out of his way to fulfill the dream of the little boy that the worm copied of seeing a moonbow. He's also able to finally become Tendo's friend, by being the one to help him out. Instead of it being Tendo always having to save Kagami because he's a weak and naive idiot against the worm, Kagami has to help the Tendo be able to understand people well enough to not give up on the sister when it seems like she wanted nothing to do with him anymore. Kagami becoming as much of a reassurance to Tendo as Tendo was to Kagami. creating one of the greatest duos in all of Kamen Rider. But now, we have to get to their direct opposites.
仮面ライダーカブトこの後すぐ
These two are pretty much a direct contrast to everything about Tendo Kagami, and represent what the message of Kabuto truly is. As Kabuto is a show about independence, essentially finding your own path in life that allows you to prosper, and thus the people around you to prosper as you become a better person. These two are never able to reach this. Let's start out with Yagaruma, who is a higher up in Zek, being to lead his own organization known as Shadow. As the B, he believes in the path he calls perfect harmony. Essentially the idea that you can't do anything on your own without others helping in some way. Which isn't an inherently bad idea, but it can lead to dependency when taken to the extreme. Yagaruma also doesn't fully follow into this idea either, as he's very much like Tendo in the way that he wants to stand out. Seen with how a simple order to defeat Tendo became more and more about his pride being damaged with how strong Tendo was. But the B's actor doesn't want to be used by a guy who wants to be a king bee and will become independent, but instead by a bee who will work for a bigger hive. This is where Kageyama comes in, who's more of the main user of the bee, as he's the extreme of the perfect harmony ideal, as he's entirely dependent in all of his actions, whether it be for Zek or any other person who will give him the attention. A detail I like to show the difference between him and Yagaruma is the outfits they wear. Yagaruma, when he was the leader of Zek, almost always was dressed in his own nice suit. While Kageyama has a suit of his own he wears, there are a good amount of instances where he wears the armor that the Zek troopers of Shadow wear, showing how he willingly makes himself more just another member of the group than trying to be a leader like Yagaruma was. Kageyama is also hated by everyone else in the series, as well he's just a spineless loser who latches onto anyone he sees as strong. This is exactly what he does when Yagaruma comes back as Kickhopper, now being a depressed weirdo who talks about having experienced a hell that destroyed him mentally. Kageyama initially rejects his offer of joining him in hell, as he already saw Yagaruma as a loser, the minute he couldn't become the B. But once Kageyama is abandoned by Zek for being a loser, he decides to become Kamen Rider Punch Hopper, joining Yagaruma in hell, creating the true dichotomy between them and Tendo and Kagami. While Tendo's Path of Heaven allows him to continually grow as a person and inspire others, Yagaruma's Path of Hell only has him become a worse person, looking down upon himself and everything that he's ever done. And while Kagami eventually grew out of being dependent on Tendo, Kageyama never did. The only reason he even hangs out with Yagaruma anymore is the fact that Yagaruma is the only person pathetic enough to really confide in Kageyama of all people, leading to the two of them getting the worst fate of any of the characters in the show, as Yagaruma kills Kageyama after he becomes a worm, and says that it's time for the two of them to see the light that only they can see, never to be seen again, implying that he might have died there alone and forgotten. A sad but fitting end for the two characters, who never grew, but simply became worse over the series.
仮面ライダーカブトこの後すぐ
The least important of the main riders, but that's not a bad thing either. Daisuke is a makeup artist whose only interest is freedom, finding women whose makeup will look good on, and helping out this little kid named Gon, who hangs out with him and is essentially his assistant. Again, like I said, he shows up the least out of all the writers, with his plotline with Gon, who wants to find her mother, being finished in 8 episodes. And he rides into the sunset, where he could have never shown up again, and I would perfectly be fine with that. People joke about how absent he is, but his character feels written around the fact that his actor was going to be absent due to actually having a decent music career around the airing of the show. Because he's the only writer with no interest in being a Kamen Rider, seeing it as a burden to his interest of just freelancing as a makeup artist wherever he can find work. But still being a good guy despite that. Seen with when it seemed like God forgot all about him, he was perfectly fine with that as long as she was happy with her mom. He was never there for a long time, but whenever he was, it was a good time. Now, let's move on to the best character in the show.
仮面ライダーカブトこの後すぐ
The GOAT! Tsurugi is a rich boy, belonging to the apparently wealthy Discabil family, and being taken care of by his butler, Gia, for all of his life. But a year ago, before the series, his sister was murdered by a worm. Tsurugi takes on the mantle of Kamen sword in order to destroy all of the worms in revenge. But he also eventually learns that he's kind of broke, except for the work that Gia does to still have the money to keep him happy, causing him to start wanting to understand the common folk and get a job to put his family back on top, and also to impress his crush Misaki by proving to her that he's not as stuck up as she thinks he is. This is why Tsurugi is my GOAT, because seeing the trials and errors of this man's failures to understand the common folk is honestly one of the funniest things in the world. Bro tries to understand how the common folk dress and ends up putting on some kid's uniform, and it's genuinely funny. It also adds to his personality that's essentially just goofy Tendo. And I already think Tendo's really funny, so just make him a bit of a loser, you get a goated character. But we have to sadly move on to the tragedy of Tsurugi, as in reality, he's a worm. Specifically the worm who killed his sister and the true Tsurugi, a fact that Gia and later Kagami hides from him, but he eventually does find out about, right when Misaki starts to like him too. Like, come on, man! Don't hurt me like this! But they do, as Tsurugi formulates a plan to destroy the rest of the worms and himself. A sad end, but what he would have wanted. Like, yeah, it sucks that he died, but Tsurugi just isn't the guy to have accepted the fact that he's a worm, especially the worm that killed his sister. So for him to die at the hands of Tendo isn't something that he would have hated. It's just super depressing for me as a viewer. But in the end, is Kamen Rider Kabuto good? Yeah. While there are some aspects such as, again, the native worms, which I don't like at all, and rather the show had never introduced them, but it also introduced me to some of my favorite characters in Rider, with Tendo, Kagami, and Tsurugi, creating a high tier show all in all. But that was me though. Leave your opinions in the comments below, and maybe like and subscribe while you're down there. See you in another review where I'm hopefully just as positive.